In the annals of time, riding social forces as they crest and crash onto the shores of history, some would-be heroes stumble but manage to recover their breath. Others are reduced to the flotsam and jetsam of nostalgia. These others are our subjects. They are the vanquished, 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 vanquished.
And we are joined by a special guest, a former boss of mine, actually, and a good friend, Lee Camp. Thanks for coming on the pod.
Yes, that is actually my my regular bio, just former boss of Anders Lee.
You could get away with a lot there because I'm also the same name as a hockey player, a famous hockey player, so you could apply to all sorts of...
You know, I have the same name as a famous... soccer player, footballer, and so it'd be good to see him compete against your hockey player.
We could see which sport is truly better, and or which is the more boring sport, which is also another competition. But we are talking today about a legendary man who's, you know, the show's about failed presidential candidates. This guy is maybe the first to fail in a non-electoral sense. He was vanquished quite literally by an assassin's bullet. But I remember on Redacted Tonight, for those who don't know, Lee and I used to be on the show Redacted Tonight. He was the main host. And sometimes we would talk a little bit about the Kennedy assassinations, and I remember doing a segment about RFK, and I was like up all night doing research, and I had just like so much information, and Lee was like, you have to distill this into a 3-minute thing. And I was like, okay, but the audio tapes, there's forensics that say the acoustics had the bullet coming out of a window, just like stacks and stacks of research. But why don't we start like with you guys? What was your first exposure to Bobby Kennedy and the Kennedy assassination? I know with me, I learned about him in high school, and I think the Emilio Estevez movie, Bobby, was probably the first time I really thought about him. But Lee, what about you?
I mean, it's weird because he was always on this kind of list of he was like the also ran on list of massive assassinations back then with JFK, MLK, and Malcolm X, and then people be like, "Oh yeah, also there was kind of Bobby Kennedy," and you're like, but when you look into it, it's so insane to just like murder I mean, so is JFK and all of them, but to murder a presidential candidate who's just won the California primary with tons of people standing around, and then I didn't look into like the details of it until we were doing Redacted Tonight, I think. I never really bothered. And then you quickly learn there's like 14 bullets, despite the fact that Sirhan's gun only held 8 bullets. And, the main shot that killed him came from behind his ear while Sirhan was in front of him. And yeah, there's a lot of things.
And Fred, what about you?
Oh yeah, for me, he's liberalism, Jesus. If he hadn't died, we'd be in a liberal paradise. Everything would be great. You always learn that he would have won the nomination and he would have won the election if he wasn't killed. And then when we're researching Humphrey, who we just did, the delegate math at least makes that seem more doubtful. But yeah, he's portrayed as this saint. And then when you look earlier in his life, he's also kind of a jerk. So he has both saint and jerk in him. He contains multitudes.
Right. That's actually a good segue because...
Real quick. Well, just because you guys did this previous episode, where was he in the delegates when he was killed?
I think he was gaining. There are a lot of delegates that were assigned to quote unquote favorite son candidates who were going to go to Humphrey, because Humphrey didn't run in any primaries. They're just like getting popular people from the state to run and be like, "What we're going to get in our delegates." But California, obviously, a lot of delegates there. So I think he was on his way to the most elected delegates, if I'm not mistaken. Is it, Fred, would you say?
That sounds right. I'm not sure if him and McCarthy had more. The thing is, I believe 75% of the delegates were not decided in primaries. Primaries didn't become important until the next cycle. So Humphrey, if the party bosses wanted to, they still could have nominated Humphrey, and they ended up doing that over McCarthy. But RFK had a huge amount of momentum, and he was a Kennedy, so you'd probably put him as the favorite, but it wasn't a guarantee.
Yeah. Yeah, and also not necessarily guaranteed that he would beat Nixon, as we'll get to. But at a later day, we're going to go into his early life. But for this episode, Fred mentioned he has kind of a nasty side to him. In 1960, he was JFK's campaign manager and kind of served as the attack dog. He was he would say all the dirty stuff the candidate didn't want in his mouth. At this point, Joe Kennedy, the patriarch's worth $400 million. That's $3.8 billion in today's money, and he funded his son very well. And he had kind of a scorched earth campaign strategy against Hubert Humphrey, who went on to run in 1968. And there's the West Virginia primaries, maybe some dirty tricks against Hubert Humphrey, saying that he avoided military service, even though, as we covered on the last episode, he tried to get in the military. They're like, we cannot let you in. You're too messed up. But he also was. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Let me add. So yeah, basically, Joe Kennedy's like a one-man super PAC back then, and no other really rich person is involved in this. And the way it works is whoever his oldest son is has to run for president. Initially, it's Joe Jr. He dies in World War II. Then it's Jack, and then later it's going to be Bobby, and eventually even Ted is going to get in the mix.
And RFK was pretty instrumental too at getting the deal to put LBJ on the ticket, even though he wanted Scoop Jackson, who's coming up in the news as like a domestic liberal, but like a really hawkish Democrat on foreign policy. But what was RFK's role at the 1960 convention?
So JFK asked LBJ to be the running mate. And LBJ makes sense because you need to win the South, and also LBJ has a lot of influence in Texas. And then big thing in the 1960 election is it's pretty damn corrupt. And there's going to be corruption in Illinois that everyone knows about, and also in Texas. You could find extra votes if you needed them, kind of like the Trump call with Georgia. That was going on a lot back then. And then the thing is, Bobby hates LBJ, and he goes to LBJ, and he's trying to talk him out of accepting it. He hoped LBJ would say no and just want to be leader of the Senate. And they end up getting in some heated conversations. And then from this point on, LBJ dislikes Bobby. Bobby already disliked him for other reasons that we'll get into.
Long-standing grudge there between the Kennedys in general and LBJ, but especially Bobby. Maybe the reason he didn't like them is because they were Catholic, which was an issue there. But he was RFK was kind of shrewd about getting Catholic voters to turn out in the 1960 election, which may have helped put Kennedy over the top, but also very likely that there was some cheating, dirty tricks that went on both sides, but ultimately that helped JFK win. RFK becomes Attorney General after Kennedy's inaugurated, which is kind of a weird move. I don't think that's ever been done in American history, to just make your brother the Attorney General. With that, I assume that was pretty controversial at the time.
It seems. Yeah,
there's other examples of putting family members in at big positions, are there not?
I guess so, but the cabinet feels like a new step, but maybe not.
Bill tried to do it like Hillary was sort of an unofficial cabinet person at the beginning, working on health care.
Right.
They may have even, I gotta remember if they passed a law. It seemed Attorney General was also the most corrupt one. And of course, the guy who thought of the idea was Joe Sr., who's still very much around running things at this point. And he basically said, "There's only one thing that I want, and I want it." And they had to do it because he was their sponsor. Because
Aaron Kushner solved Palestine and Israel. So that Trump put him in charge of. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. What a guy. So Martin Luther King at the time is he's getting released from prison, and that he comes around and endorses JFK in the 1960 election. But they have kind of a rocky relationship, especially when RFK is Attorney General. There's some skepticism, mutual skepticism between the Kennedys and King. But that kind of, how does that change over the course of JFK's presidency?
They never quite get along, but they do work together on stuff. There's definitely there's an idea of at least RFK and JFK are helping civil rights. They kind of can do the thing where they say we're the best administration so far for civil rights. Kind of similar to like Biden will say with climate, like we passed the best climate bill so far because no climate bills were passed before that. But they don't just quite get along on an interpersonal level, and they're distrusting of each other. And MLK should distrust him because RFK does eventually approve J. Edgar Hoover, who's a humongous figure in this time, a wiretap of RFK.
Right.
Of
MLK.
King.
MLK, yeah. Also, RFK's in like all these cabinet meetings about stuff that doesn't necessarily have that much to do with the Department of Justice, the like foreign policy stuff. He's got to take on the Bay of Pigs. He's and also JFK.
Right, so he was kind of JFK's top advisor at the same time, right?
Right. Someone called him assistant president. Which, he would later say gave him the requisite experience. And they couldn't look at each other during some of the cabinet meetings. And Bobby eventually had to have his seat moved.
That's LBJ.
Sorry.
Bobby's basically doing the role that LBJ would have wanted to be, which is like the assistant president, and they are not. They're not on speaking terms because LBJ realized his only chance to become president was to be VP, and RFK is the guy who tried to stop it. So that's a lifelong grudge. RFK is the kind of guy you'd have a lifelong grudge with. Jimmy Hoffa and him also had that. So he had like a few mortal enemies throughout his life.
And he was on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which some would argue is the big reason for the JFK assassination. RFK wanted an embargo rather than bombing. Is that correct? And he kind of was in JFK's ear, getting him to not go with the CIA plan.
Yeah, he doesn't like the idea of attacking Cuba in a somewhat of a surprise attack. He says that would be kind of like us doing Pearl Harbor. That's un-American. And that helps because very early on, there's a lot of people in the room who want to do a bombing of the missile sites, and then that would have led to at least like a small nuclear war, a lot of bad outcomes. So it was good to have the voice of peace in the room.
Yeah. So overall, the Kennedy administration is okay on civil rights. It's better than presidencies that had come before it, but it's maybe not today what we would see as like an enlightened administration. And as you mentioned, they're wiretapping King, but there's like legislation being held up in the Senate, which Kennedy isn't able to get through and doesn't trust Johnson enough to like push through, even though that's his true talent. What was their general kind of civil rights policy? Do you think they could have gotten a good civil rights bill, like the one Johnson signed if JFK hadn't been killed?
That's interesting. The key is if you could break the filibuster, and then LBJ and with Humphrey, they figured they break it. It's very involved. It's weird. LBJ is great at domestic policy, bad at foreign policy, and then Kennedy is kind of the opposite.
Yeah.
Ideally, I guess he could have had LBJ doing running the Congress, but the problem is they're afraid if you give LBJ any power, he'll be hard to control, and he is hard to control because he's a psycho. So.
Yeah. So that he's RFK seen as a good attorney general, historically speaking, even though there's, going into the Kennedy administration, some ties to the mafia that he quickly severs and decides to go after the mob, which is a pretty ballsy move because, I mean, it depends on which historian you listen to, but some people think that the Kennedys were aided in 1960 by Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob, mobsters around the country, but unions are very mobbed up at that point, for better or worse, and Kennedy really, really goes after them and makes some enemies. What do you...
And RFK kind of leads that, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
RFK is really the attack dog on getting these hearings and going after Jimmy Hoffa in particular. And meanwhile, JFK is getting other enemies in the deep state. So this leads to possibly a toxic combination, and it kind of all comes to a head in Dallas in 1963, where immediately after his brother's killed, RFK is obviously very upset, but immediately he smells something fishy, and there's a whole book by David Talbot called Brothers. It's just about somewhat about their relationship, but also the years after the JFK assassination, RFK being maybe the first conspiracy theorist, because he definitely thought something was up.
It must have, when he decided to run, he must have thought that there was a 50-50 chance he'd be murdered. A pretty high percentage, because not only had his brother been murdered, but Mary Meyer, who was JFK's longtime mistress and everything, she starts speaking up about how it was the CIA and the Warren report's not correct, and she's calling RFK like she knows him, and she's talking to him about these things, and then she's murdered in broad daylight. So there's no way he wasn't yeah, I'm probably gonna get killed during this.
Yeah, it was kind of a devil may care attitude about it. He almost was ready for it and didn't care. I remember in 10th grade, my history teacher telling me, he was from North Dakota, and he was saying that that spring in 1968 during the primaries, North Dakota was one of the states, and he just saw Bobby Kennedy out at a coffee shop without any security. And he was like, shouldn't you have security guards? He was like, yeah, I just wanted to get away from them. He could have been killed at several points, but he kind of was, I don't know, on a mission from God or something. But we know he definitely thought that was a possibility, and certainly people like Jackie Kennedy thought that was a possibility, and were concerned that Bobby was going to get God as well.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, Bobby, he doesn't take. I believe if he had asked for Secret Service, he could have gotten it. In California, he doesn't have the LAPD helping him because he doesn't get along with them. He rides in open convertibles. He's doing motorcade. It's a very old school campaign. It's not so much TV based. And he's just if I die, I die. Which is going back to Lincoln. Presidents and presidential candidates have said that, and then ended up dying. So it's good that maybe after RFK people stop saying that.
Right. It's funny, after Lincoln, they thought that would be a one-off, and they were like, yeah, we don't really need a Secret Service detail. They're not going to do that again. And then Garfield gets shot, and the Secret Service has to take some time away from currency manipulation.
Well, yeah, I know they were doing currency manipulation initially, but wasn't it the day that Abraham Lincoln was killed, he signed the Secret Service into creation?
Oh, did he?
But it was about currency, but it was that day.
Right. Big issue back then.
Fiat money was non-gold, paper money was very new in the Civil War. I think that's the first time we used greenback, so that does make sense.
Yeah. So one of the attempted debunkings of the Talbot thesis and the idea that RFK thought there was a conspiracy out there is that in public, he says that he believes the Warren Commission and that there's no conspiracy, which is sort of a deceptive way to spin it, because obviously in public, he's not going to come out and say Alan Dulles killed my brother and I'm on a quest to avenge him. That's
right.
not a very politically shrewd statement to make to the American people. But he says in 1964 he's convinced Oswald was solely responsible and that he hasn't read the Warren Commission. JFK Jr. at one point says that Bobby knew everything, which I wonder what secrets he took to his watery grave as well. But there's...
and RFK Jr. has said that right after JFK was killed, his father, he remembers the phone call. His father immediately called the CIA and said, "Did you do this?"
Right.
So his suspicions from day one were...
Yeah. And
let me tell you.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. Let me tell you. Yeah, so he finds out the assassination. Hoover calls the house. He'd never called before. And then he's mourning his brother. And then LBJ calls him from like Air Force One being like, "I don't know the words to the swearing in oath. Can you tell me it?" And it's like there's probably other people he could have called, but he almost does it to rub it in Bobby's face, like, "I'm the one in power now."
Wow.
Very important that they get that. And yeah, they do the swearing in on the tarmac, and Jackie's got the blood-stained coat. Very raw scene. So there's some speculation about, speaking of Jackie Kennedy, about her and Bobby. Fred, do you think they had a thing?
Yeah, so I like this one better because, the JFK assassination stuff, it's very nebulous. There's a million threads. It's so much noise, I can't figure it out. But I like this nice, simple one. Bobby becomes a surrogate father. He's vacationing with Jackie. They move to New York at the same time. And this book I read called Bobby and Jackie, it seems like they did sleep together. Because, these people were pretty polyamorous in general. She was dating a few guys. He was never faithful to Ethel. And also the nice thing is that I learned is that he's much better in bed than JFK. JFK just wanted to wham bam, thank you, ma'am. He was like a lover. He would have real affairs. Yeah, so that is that is an edge he has over his brother.
That's the important thing to know.
Yeah, he's more liberal in that also as a lover.
Well, yeah, JFK was, he had 100 diseases, rickets, his body, he was constantly in pain. So he just sex for him was just instant gratification and then move on. And he would try to do it as many times in one day as he could because he's in so much physical misery. So yeah, it makes sense that Bobby'd be a little more dexterous in bed. But he does help her get $50,000 a month from the Kennedy Foundation. And yeah, they're living in New York at the same time. And RFK for a while is still the Attorney General. It's very awkward. Johnson's the president, and he hates RFK, who's just there because his brother is now dead. And basically gets in the words of Oliver Stone, his balls cut off. He doesn't have a whole lot of power in the administration, and he definitely can't investigate his brother's assassination.
So did Johnson keep him there just because it would look bad to also get rid of RFK?
Yeah, I think at first there's kind of an obligation to do that, but he doesn't stay that long, right, Fred? It's only
Oh, yeah. So, there's another year. One book says that he doesn't show up to work that much. The big thing is Hoover had been in office for a very long time. He was an institution and basically until he dies during the Nixon administration. So JFK would set it up where Hoover had to go through his boss, Bobby, who was the Attorney General, and not directly the president. The second JFK dies, it's back to Hoover going right to the president. LBJ and RFK, they're not going to get along, and it's back to just like the way things usually work on RFK's sideline. Then they're considering making him VP nominee, but LBJ realizes he can beat Goldwater without him and makes Bobby withdraw, and then Bobby's just going to run for Senate and not be part of the second LBJ term, if you will.
Right. Yeah, which this is sort of, I guess, I don't know if it's totally unprecedented either, but he moves to New York and runs for Senate there, even though he's from Massachusetts. And Keating, who's the incumbent sort of liberal Republican, tries to call him a carpetbagger. They call him mophead. They try to say he's not a New Yorker, but turns out New Yorkers just love the Kennedys. So even though he's gone after the mob, and that's more of an institution, he gets elected to the U.S. Senate. He does win, though, you noted, Fred, by a lower margin in New York than LBJ does, also in 1964.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So, there's huge, LBJ, one of the biggest Democratic wins ever in a presidential election. So he has coattails. But, RFK doesn't win by a huge margin. One fun thing in this election is they want to do a debate. RFK refuses. And then Keating tries to debate an empty chair. And RFK's like, well, if I show up, then he'll have to let me in. And then King's like, I won't let you in. But then because RFK showed up, he's not technically refusing to debate. So they make him remove the empty chair and just like talk to himself at the debate.
Wow.
So is RFK heckling from the crowd? Or?
I think he's outside, but that would have been fun. Yeah.
So the guy just seems like he's got voices in his head or something. Okay.
Yeah.
The great Clint Eastwood speech for Romney.
True.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the rivalry with LBJ sparks up again with Bobby in the Senate. LBJ calls him that little shit ass, which I like the idea. He has all these specific nicknames for people he hates that are different swear words, and his staff knows who's who. But he would sometimes make gestures that he was going to slit RFK's throat, and also calls him that guy who was the guy who almost kept me from my destiny, which shows you how LBJ views power. Kennedy openly has supported the war in Vietnam kind of tepidly up to this point, but as senator starts to question it. How does that happen, Fred?
Okay, let me add one other thing. And I don't have any evidence, but basically the more you learn about LBJ, the more you see he's the kind of guy who's capable of having a Kennedy kills. Like he has the motivation. They're maybe going to replace him in the ticket in 64 if JFK doesn't die. He just, and he's evil enough, and he hates the Kennedy. He hates the Kennedy, especially RFK, enough. And then as it goes on though, as far as the Vietnam War, at first it's kind of like LBJ is worried that if he goes against the Vietnam War, RFK will say, well, that was my brother's legacy. But then as the war is not working, RFK is moving more towards saying this doesn't make sense. He's saying bombing the North is not going to, if that's the only way to win, then we're not going to win, stuff like that.
Yeah, it was kind of a compromised position at that point that, the war's not going well. We need a new course. Not that dissimilar from Iraq 20 years ago or so. But he, even though the Kennedys are not seen as great on civil rights and LBJ is seen as a better civil rights president, Bobby feels that LBJ kind of dropped the ball after 1965 and wants to continue building on the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, create programs to help Black neighborhoods. He helps renovate, actually, near where I live in Bed-Stuy, and is pretty responsive as a senator to like constituents who are like living in property owned by slumlords. His office was pretty good about like intimidating landlords into to maintaining stuff better, at least. But he does give a speech on the Watts riots, and he is trying to improve on he and his brother's legacy in this area. And this leads him to be kind of hated in the South among Southern whites. They call him Raul Castro, after the little brother of Fidel. And so he's kind of loved and hated in the South based on what race the person is. But this plays a role in the 68 race. He's for civil rights and for racial repair, I guess, but he's not necessarily a big proponent of welfare programs. What can you tell us about that, Fred?
That's the weird thing. He says if you have a handout, you lose motivation. Makes no sense because his dad gave him a huge handout, and he's insanely hardworking anyway.
Sounds like Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't want any handouts, but he's handed his entire.
Right. Yeah.
Let me say one other thing on civil rights. So basically, LBJ's thing was once you get black people to vote, you're good. That's it. You don't have to worry about economic stuff. They should be happy. And then pretty much immediately after they passed the Voting Rights Act, then the Watts riots happen. And he's like, he just feels black people are ungrateful. He kind of goes back to the old LBJ where he's not so interested in civil rights, which is his whole career before the 60s. But RFK is no more about economic stuff, and he really becomes, like the forefront of civil rights. And it's we'll see if he would have gotten to do anything as president, because obviously Nixon's not going to do anything to help with that.
Yeah. So going into 1968, Johnson wants to run for re-election because he's, constitutionally he's allowed to do it. And Bobby, people are calling for him to run. There's a whole movement to draft an anti-war candidate to primary Johnson. And Bobby doesn't see a serious path to it. So he declines people's overtures. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, the big thing, there's a guy going around, I don't have the guy's name in front of me, but he's recruiting people. RFK says no, he eventually gets McCarthy to run. So theoretically, if RFK had said yes earlier, then McCarthy wouldn't have even been involved.
Right.
The big thing is that a lot of this is in 67 or early 68, which is pre-Tet. And pre-Tet, LBJ still looked like he'd be a right to at least get the nomination, at least have a good shot against Nixon. But then post-Tet is when it's going to look a little better, and then RFK is going to jump in a bit too late.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As we covered in the last episode, McCarthy comes in second in New Hampshire, and they're fairly close, relatively close. And then Kennedy hops in. There's someone behind the scenes who's like, well, you declined to run earlier, and McCarthy decided to run, so why don't you bow out and let him do it, and then you run some other time? And Bobby just says, Kennedys don't do that. Kind of a sense of entitlement there. But he's decides on March 16th to announce his candidacy, the same room where his brother declares his candidacy in 1960. And Bobby says,
it was the upstairs room at a brothel, right?
Well, it's the Senate office building, okay. So not too far off.
Yeah.
In the caucus room. But he says, I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies. I'm convinced this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, I feel I'm obliged to do all that I can. And as you wrote down, Fred, Kennedy is more disliked by the business establishment than any candidate since Roosevelt, basically. So he's got his work cut out for him, but he's popular among some younger voters, although a lot of them are supporting McCarthy. And I actually remember that's what my history teacher said in high school, who was like, I ran into Bobby Kennedy, but I was still supporting McCarthy at that time because he had been the most consistent on Vietnam. But quickly it becomes a two-person race, I guess a three-person with Humphrey lurking in the background there. But Johnson drops out, and we know he says, I will not seek and I shall not accept nomination to be president, but he secretly wants to be nominated anyway, and he wants to kind of come back in August at the convention.
So what I haven't actually studied why he dropped out. What led to that? Why if he was so power hungry, why would he do that?
I mean, it's a good question. I think a lot of it was after New Hampshire was just a humiliation, and when Bobby started running, he saw he was going to have to fight for the nomination. It's going to be a divided field. And I think he really did think that he could still, he could just kind of go back to being president and ignore the race for a while and say publicly that he was out, and then all the delegates would still come rushing back. So I think it was like ultimately kind of an ego thing. Like they would come crawling back and renominate him.
So the others would beat each other up in the primaries, and then at the end of the day, the delegates would super delegates would put him in anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing is, he just could not handle losing to Bobby. Like, they hate each other too much. He doesn't want to risk it. He has a fear of failure. And at one point after Ted, Edward R. Murrow comes out and says the Vietnam War is not working. And he's like, if I've lost Murrow, I've lost the country. And that's the thing. Back then, a news anchor could influence the presidential election.
Yeah.
So going into the California primary, Bobby has won Indiana, where he gives a speech the night King is assassinated. And this is a famous speech where he says to the audience, my brother was killed by a white man also, so I could kind of understand where you're coming from. And he's able to win Indiana by appealing to different demographics of low-income whites and other races as well. But he also loses Oregon to McCarthy, where this is what some historians say did him in. He was walking on the beach barefoot. And Oregonians at the time apparently didn't like that very much. But going into California...
And yeah, John Kerry windsurfing seemed to have zero impact.
Yeah, something about...
One other thing...
Go ahead.
Yeah. Oregon, very white state. That's not good for RFK. And also, he's for gun control, and that's not going to be popular in Oregon either. So yeah, it's not a great state for him, but it is a little embarrassing because not that there's that many races, but no Kennedy had lost any election before that, so it's a little bit embarrassing, though he is going to rebound quickly in California.
Mm-hmm.
And also, parts of Oregon were not like they are now. There wasn't as much dyed hair and the nose ring in the middle. So.
Right. Yeah. But Kennedy's base is very diverse. Like like McCarthy is appealing to a lot of young, particularly white college students who are against the war, and Kennedy is appealing more towards black voters and Latin voters, people who feel now an affinity with his brother. And there's some concern among his campaign that he isn't going to be able to break out of that and appeal to enough white voters to beat Nixon. But he's able to win the California primary, and there's a movie Bobby, which it was really good, which is like kind of it's a bunch of different perspectives leading up to the RFK assassination, but it's kind of about the California primary. And
Oliver Stone make that too?
No, that was Emilio Estevez. Who was, I don't think he's directed a ton of other movies, but that one was actually pretty good.
It was good. It's definitely the RFK myth of just him being, like I said, liberalism Jesus. But it's a sweet movie, and it does portray. I remember talking to my mom. Like, people did believe that he was going to be the nominee when he got shot. So like there was a lot of hope right after he won that primary, and that's what the movie's really about.
Well, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to shoot him if you didn't think he was at least had a good chance of being nominated.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, true. Something I should mention too. So at in Indiana, where he's trying to appeal to the university crowd, he's at a medical school, and one of the students asks him, where are we going to get the money to pay for these new programs you're proposing? And Kennedy says, from you. So he's saying he's going to, raise taxes on well-to-do people and redistribute it a little bit. And
Kamala needs to recreate that moment. Just do it. Just go for it.
Yeah. Wouldn't be a bad move.
You're saying that'd be better than nothing will fundamentally change?
Yes. Yeah. Finally, she's released some policies, but nothing too similar to Bobby Kennedy, who I believe he was talking about like universal basic income and universal health care. It's kind of hard to find some of the platform details, but I know you learned some of them, Fred.
There is talk that he would have done universal health care. Now, to be fair to him, he wasn't the nominee. He didn't have a convention. So
Right.
they would have had a platform at the convention, but of course he didn't live to that. So he might have ironed out the policies a little better then. So it's a lot of just anti-war, civil rights, and kind of just like kind of the great vibe. It's a very sexy campaign. People wanted to touch JFK. People wanted to grab Bobby. They even say like for the campaign staffers, they didn't have to do foreplay. The campaign itself was an aphrodisiac. So this is one of the sexier campaigns in history, and the candidate getting shot before the convention only helps.
Also, I think one of his platforms was universal basic fingering. Wasn't that right?
Well, you said, Fred, that there may have been an orgy after the assassination.
I was speculating, but I feel like if they were already horny and then he died, like it's like the last night, I could picture them all having an orgy the night he died. And it's kind of weird and evil, but like there is a weird, evil, medieval kind of vibe to the Kennedy, so it kind of fits.
Yeah. Another interesting kind of sexy detail, depending on what you're into, is he would let reporters watch him have ice cream and beer in bed.
There's such an intimacy. Also, he's a chocoholic. That's my most relatable thing about him. Redhead, and he loved chocolate ice cream with chocolate syrup. I love that so much.
And what exactly was he wearing during the in-bed ice cream scenario?
I don't think naked. I could see him maybe being in like an undershirt and boxers or something. I don't think he would be fully clothed was the vibe, but definitely not. Yeah, like he wasn't fully naked either. LBJ, of course, would have been naked in this scenario.
Oh. Yeah, chocolate on chocolate. I can definitely relate to. You would think you'd have to do a different flavor, but no, it goes better with itself. Meanwhile, LBJ is, there's some pressure for him to weigh in on this ongoing primary, but RFK gets him to be neutral because, in all honesty, he doesn't really care if it's McCarthy or Kennedy. Doesn't like either of them. If it's going to be somebody he wants Humphrey, and that's a bad look for him to support his VP too much. As we're saying this whole time, Kennedy's riding around in convertibles. He's kind of got a reckless attitude, arguably. Meanwhile, in California, there's churches turning people out. You noted, Fred, Willie Brown helps coordinate turnout for Bobby, who then goes on to date Kamala Harris at some point. And before the vote, though, there is a debate in California with Eugene McCarthy. There's some interesting stuff that comes out in that debate, right, Fred?
Yeah, so overall, they're both mostly agreeing, but there's not huge issue differences in them. They're both kind of in the left end of the Democratic Party. The one thing is McCarthy says, "I'll fire J. Edgar Hoover," which is a big thing and also the kind of thing that would get you killed. But Bobby can't say that because Hoover has files on JFK, on Bobby. So like Hoover has leverage over them. He knows what Bobby did with Marilyn Monroe. There's definitely rumors with him and Marilyn Monroe, either that they slept together, that he had her killed, both maybe, who knows. And the other thing is Joe, and we'll get into it in the Patreon episode, but Joe Kennedy was very anti-Semitic, and Bobby is overcompensating by being pro-Israel. Which then supposedly in the the consent, like the more establishment version of the assassination, is what motivates Sirhan to kill him.
Right. Yes. That part of his legacy maybe has not aged well. That he was super pro-Israel, and he voted to send I think bombs and to fight the 6-Day War, and that's what motivated Sirhan.
Yeah, and JFK was the first president to send them arms. This is pretty soon after 67, so you can still sort of see Israel as an underdog because Israel post 67 is not an underdog, but it's still, people are still kind of in that transition time as the 67 war was only a year ago.
Yeah. So at the Ambassador Hotel, he gives this great speech. The campaign is in a new phase. It looks like he's got a clear track to the nomination, although who knows what would happen. And then, boom, he goes into the kitchen, and there's no one in front of him. And there's celebrities all over the place, which makes it even more surreal. Like George Plimpton is there. There's like pro athletes, and there's shots ring out, and we all know that part of the story. But there's some interesting inconsistencies, like as Lee brought up, the bullet that killed Kennedy came from the back, and Sirhan, everybody says was in front of him. Maybe he turned around a little bit, but it's unlikely that all those other things would add up as well. I did just read Lisa Pease has a great book. I don't know, Lee has interviewed her about the RFK assassination, and she's not a professional historian or anything, but her book is pretty well documented, and there's like a lot of sort of conspiracy theories that she does not include. She's pretty rigorous about what she will entertain, and apparently the audio of the shooting, a lot of people get kind of caught up in that, and she thinks that's kind of just a red herring, like that you're not going to be able to find anything definitive from the audio one way or the other. She looks at the forensics, the ballistics, and yeah, the fact that the amount of bullets, and her book was reviewed in the Washington Post, and they didn't really find any factual problems with it. So it seems to me that it's a pretty hard argument to make that there wasn't something going on. Although, like the part of it that was hardest for me to accept is that Sirhan probably would have had to been hypnotized, which sounds kind of crazy.
Right. So I actually just interviewed her a couple of weeks ago again.
Okay, cool.
And about this in her book. She actually was the one who recommended, I only had a half an hour with her. She recommended, like, if we try and cover everything, all the bullet holes and everything, there's no way we do it in half an hour. So she said, let's focus on the hypnotism aspect. And I liked that because that for me initially was also the part where I was like, this is silly, he was hypnotized or whatever. But I don't know if you ever have, Andrews, but I have been on performances where there were hypnotists as like the headliner a few times, and I'm the like opening act years ago. And so I've been in a lot of many hypnotism shows, and there's no doubt in my mind that at least a certain percentage of those up on stage they're not goofing around. They're not playing along. They're in another state. And we'll get to whether you could kill someone in that state in a second. But, and the best example I use is I was opening for a show where the guy brought the bouncer on as one of the people to be hypnotized. And this bouncer he was at a club. I was at a lot. He's a 25-year-old, 6'4", dumb as bricks, white dude who, but was very proud of his toughness. It was all he had. I could mess that guy up and all this stuff. And the hypnotist, within 10 minutes, had him pretending to give birth to a baby and behaving very maternal and like a mother and just like teary-eyed over his baby was going to be taken away. And that guy would have agreed to behave that way. Like, it was polar opposite of who he was. So I think hypnotism can be powerful. As Lisa Pease said in her book, it's about 20% of the population can be well hypnotized. But of that 20%, there's then a smaller portion that can be so deeply hypnotized they would do some pretty crazy, awful shit. And I think that it seems very likely, like from all the interviews that you read in the book and stuff with Sirhan, he's not a very bright guy. I think he was hypnotized not to to basically fire a gun that ultimately she brings a lot of evidence had blanks in it, but to fire a gun at RFK, but he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't. And she points out that you can convince someone under hypnotism that it's not really RFK, that it's someone pretending to be RFK and all this shit. And it is some very convincing stuff. And people have, there's a few other cases of someone murdering someone while hypnotized. But I think that he was probably hypnotized, possibly also drugged, because CIA was, that's another thing she brings forward is all the evidence. The CIA was experimenting with hypnotism a lot. There's a former head of hypnotism at the CIA. Like these were the years with MK Ultra. Yes, they were experimenting with drugs, but they were also experimenting with hypnotism. And these were the years where they would have done something like this. So I think he was put forward as a distraction and a patsy. And sure enough, when someone starts firing, whether blanks or real, you don't know, everyone turns to them and everyone ignores everything else that's going on in the room. Of course, like, what are you going to do? And so it serves as a perfect distraction while the real shooters can actually do it well, as opposed to some rando, you know?
Right. Yeah, I think that is the part that kind of convinced me, is that it's not necessarily that he shot RFK. He's probably just shooting just randomly, and you can get somebody to do that. And
also, you mentioned the fact that they point to the Palestine, because he was partially Palestinian. They point to that as the reason he wanted to kill RFK. And yet, in all of his statements and everything that evening, the following days, there is nothing. I mean, first of all, he at least claims he has no recognition that he's shot at RFK. He doesn't even understand what they're saying to him. But he never says anything about Israel, anything about Palestine, anything about, fuck that guy. Nothing. They just point to that he had written in his journal like some things about Israel and RFK must die. But again, if you're screwing with hypnotism, it is incredibly easy to hypnotize someone and have them write RFK must die in their journal. So,
yeah. And there's also the question of the girl in the polka dot dress who was running. I mean, several witnesses say they saw like this woman yelling, we shot him, which in fairness does seem like a bit of a weird thing to yell if you're trying to get away.
If you're part of it, yeah.
But we do know that several witnesses have been pressured by investigators in the year since to say they did not see this person. Maybe that's like some attempt to add layer on top of layer and just confuse people. But Fred, I know you dug into this a little bit too. What do you think?
It's hard. The conspiracy stuff's hard. It's not that I don't believe it's possible. It's that there's always so much noise. It's just always hard for me to parse. So I tend to focus on other stuff. And I didn't read Lisa's book. But basically, everyone is like, they're going to kill him. They're going to kill him. And then one thing, I guess for me, my question is, why does he need to have blanks? Because why can't you just have him shooting real bullets? Wouldn't that make it more likely for him to die? Why are the blanks so important?
Because it'd be fairly likely he's going to kill in a different state, a trance-like state. He's probably going to kill the other shooters. He might kill other random people around. So I think it's like they don't want him really killing. Like you said, there's all these celebrities around. They probably didn't want to kill 3 celebrities along with RFK. Yeah. I don't know.
That it becomes the George Plimpton assassination. We don't want that.
Oh,
yeah. Because we're kind of rounding out here. I mean, that's so the common wisdom tends to bend in the direction of like he would have won the nomination, he would have beat Nixon and become president. It's maybe not a foregone conclusion, either of those things. It would have been very unpopular, I think, to take the nomination away from Bobby and give it to Humphrey, more so than what happened, because there really, after Kennedy was killed, was not a clear alternative to Humphrey, so he was able to kind of fill the vacuum. But even that was pretty rough, obviously, at the 68 convention. So I think there's maybe a chance that all the power brokers are like, all right, we got to give it to him. He's just too popular. It's going to, lead to turmoil.
Did you say he didn't have Secret Service at that point? He refused it?
I believe if he had asked, he could have gotten it. But yeah, there was no Secret Service for him. They then passed a rule giving Secret Service to the candidate, so Humphrey is well protected.
Oh,
Though no one wants to shoot Humphrey.
So maybe the reason for taking him out at that point was if they waited much longer, he'd get the nomination and then he'd have Secret Service and then it'd be much harder to get to him. I don't know.
maybe, yeah.
I don't know if nominees would get it. I think basically everyone gets it because of him, but it is much easier to do it before the convention.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. But what do you guys think? Would he have won in 1968? And if so, what kind of presidency and world would we have had?
Lee's thinking I'll go. I think he would have gotten the nomination because you're not going to go with Humphrey. Humphrey wasn't that popular, and also LBJ controls him too much. Would he have beaten? I definitely, I think he would have been able to beat Nixon. I mean, you never know, because Nixon was a good campaigner. And as far as what kind of presidency he would have, we read a counterfactual book where they talked about it, where they made him kind of seem like it was actually hard to be effective. So hopefully he would have gotten a thing or two done, but I don't know if he would have gotten as much done as people hope. And, there was a lot of forces just bringing conservatism into the country. And I don't know if he would have, been able to stop that long term. Maybe he ends up running against Reagan in 72 or something and loses. Who knows?
That's fair. I do wonder if he had made it a priority to disband the CIA or prove the CIA, like if he could release the files showing the CIA had killed his brother, we'd probably be living in a very different universe right now.
Yeah. I mean, JFK said he wanted to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it in the wind. And if you have evidence that he was killed by them, it's a lot easier to do that. But obviously, they have a vested interest in a lot of capabilities in stopping people before it gets to that point.
Yeah.
I mean, with the Jeff Greenfield book, Then Everything Changed, one of the chapters is about this question. And he seems to think that, it would have been a mixture of, like, he would have invested in urban areas with like jobs, but also he would have given a lot of money to police, and that would have helped things too in Greenfield's mind. And then, of course, he would have wound down Vietnam earlier, although some people think it still would have taken him a couple years. But interesting question. Go ahead.
Yeah, he does have a certain Batman quality in that he's a rich guy. He wants to help the disadvantaged, but not by giving up the money. So he still wants the same general class structure, but he does want to help. And in that way, maybe he's a little bit full of crap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the closest thing is we'll get is his son running for president, RFK Jr., which didn't pan out. There's a future episode of The Vanquished coming up about him. But very ultimately, maybe he would have been a very similar guy at a certain point if he had gotten elected to his son, and he'd be like going after seed oils or something like that.
By the way, if anyone listening puts a lot of stock in what RFK Jr. says, he does not believe that Sirhan Sirhan killed his father.
That's right. Yeah, and he's met with Sirhan Sirhan, and the rest of his siblings have been disgusted by it, along with other stuff he's done. But this is maybe one of the things where he's right. Cool. Well, Lee, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you and your stuff?
I appreciate it. If people like this podcast, they'd probably like my podcast, Government Secrets, which I do with Graham Elwood, which is history of the atrocious things that our government's done in the past. And they probably like that one. I also have other podcasts. I think if people look for Lee Camp, they'll find all my stuff, or go to leecamp.com.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Vanquished. If you want the full thing, because there is more, please go to patreon.com/thevanquished, where you can get the rest of this episode as well as our full episode catalog. You can support our work as well as annoy us in the comments.